Okay, hello, this is Bill Bradford. I'm an apprentice in Glenn Guy's cohort in the Arcanum. And recently I posted a photo to our community, and one of my fellow cohorts asked if I wanted to possibly do a video sort of explaining my process as I walked through and took the shot and processed the shot and such as that. So I figured I'd kill a couple of birds with one stone here and learn a little bit about recording Google Hangouts and step through sort of my thought process on this photo and share it with my fellow apprentices. So we'll get started on that, and I'll show you my Lightroom and my Photoshop and sort of what I did on here. So this was the shot. It was a little creek up in the North Georgia mountains that I went to, and this was where I started. It was on the side of the trail, and this waterfall sort of appealed to me. So I set up my tripod and framed up this shot, and as you can see, it's a 5-second exposure at f20 on ISO 100. I had done some earlier shots, or in the same setup, at a higher ISO and a larger aperture, and the water was pretty. It wasn't frozen, but it wasn't smooth. So I wanted to get something that was a little bit smoother in the water. So that's why I went to the 5-second exposure. And now I got to find the shot again. To the 5-second exposure at f20 to get that out. So I got in here and I started looking at it. But one of the things that I noticed was all of this over here on the upper right or upper left side was really a distraction, and I didn't like it. So I cropped in to sort of get something that looked a little better. I think I did a 5:7 crop, but I can't remember exactly. Actually, I bet that wasn't it. Anyway, I played around with the crop until I got something that I was happy with, which was mostly this that was on the right hand side. And I'm trying to get it to a vertical orientation because that's what I ended up liking a bit more. So anyway, so I did the crop, and I sort of the first couple of things I do is find my crop, do the lens correction in Lightroom. Really, and that's about it to begin with. Like I say, get a crop that I like. This obviously isn't it, but I've got it in another shot. So I did that, and then went back to the library and applied that crop to all of the images in iStack. I shot an HDR bracket of 5 because I figured with this light range, I wanted to try an HDR to see what happened, and I sort of shoot by brackets anyway. So I applied, I picked up all of the shots and basically synced the crop settings and such, so that they all had the same, they all had the the same lens correction and those kind of things to it. So I synchronized the settings on that, and then let me pull up the right ones here, because this is all my work that I have done through here. So I took the 5 shots and exported them to HDRFX Pro to do some HDR work and sort of process that. And so that should be loading up here. And the idea was that's sort of my typical processing is to go into HDR, since I tend to shoot a number of brackets. And we'll let that load up here. And it's taking longer than longer than I was expecting, but okay, here we go. So this shows me that I had, you know, a bracket of, oh, I picked up the wrong files in there, but my normal brackets, I'll show the end result of what I did because I didn't keep up with which sliders I processed in here, but it shows I had a bracket of -2 2/3 up to, I should have a positive 2 2/3 in here. This one, I picked up the wrong one when I picked up the 5 here just in this example, but the idea is I had a bracket of -2 2/3 stops underexposed all the way up through to positive 2 2/3 stops overexposed to give a wide range for that. And so then I went in and created the HDR, played around with the sliders. You know, didn't really have a plan for what I was looking for. To sort of, you know, by feel, picked up which ones, you know, what I wanted, what I was looking for. But I struggled with it. I won't do it here since I've already created the HDR. But I sort of struggled around with what I had, and this is what I came up with. It's pretty pretty realistic. I didn't get, you know, very crunchy with the HDR or anything along those lines. But it wasn't really appealing to me a whole lot. I mean, there was some good things there. You know, some of the rocks up here, you know, I kind of liked, and but it didn't have the same feel to it that one of the original shots had, because the rocks here on the upper and lower portions were darker, so there's more contrast in the image, some of those kind of things. So I had this, but it wasn't really, you know, wasn't really doing it for me, I guess you could say. But so what I decided was that I liked the regular exposure. I liked how dark this was, that it was just, you know, it was actually very dark, you know, was verging into probably too dark. But I liked the feel of it. And so my idea was to take that, but I also wanted a bit more water, of the water moving. So I brought in one of the overexposed or more highly exposed. Actually, in a lot of ways, this is probably more correctly exposed. But again, it was getting into the same thing that I had with the HDR image, in that the rocks here were too light for me. You know, it wasn't getting that dark sort of mood that I was looking for. But I did like the way the water looked in this one, and this was the 13-second exposure, one of my higher exposures, that had even more, you know, smoothness on the water, and then, you know, more highlights and details. But like I say, it didn't have exactly the mood that I was looking for. So what I decided to do was to take that shot and the overexposed shot, the regularly exposed shot, and the HDR version, and open those as layers in Photoshop. So I selected those three. I did edit in, layers in Photoshop, and so we'll sit here and watch my computer spin for a minute to load those up. Because the idea was I wanted to use bits and pieces of each of those different exposures. And this is something I've sort of picked up from watching some of Trey Ratcliffe's videos and some of his tutorials, was using bits and pieces of different images or different treatments on an image to get the ones that I liked, or to get the feeling that I like. So what I typically do, and I've started doing that a good bit. And what I typically do here is, once these get loaded, I'll align the layers so that they're all lined up. Okay, so I'll select all of the layers so that all three of those layers are together, and auto align the layers. And that will analyze the image and put them all in the same as close as it can. It'll stretch them and do the little warps or whatever it needs to. This was shot on a tripod. There shouldn't have been any movement, but in the HDR processing, sometimes some pixels get stretched around a bit. So we'll go off and do that. I'm going to cancel out of this because I've got my original PSD file that I'm going to load up now. But that's where I would start. I'd have these 3 images in layers, auto align, and then I'd start picking and choosing, turning on and off, sort of the pieces that I wanted. You can see the differences here. Here's sort of the I hate to say overexposed version, but it's a higher exposed version. Here's the darker one, and then here's the HDR that I put together. So let's go over to my actual file that I was working on for this and open that up and sort of walk through what I ended up doing to it. So we'll open this in Photoshop. And I'll go through the different steps that I did sort of from there, my different bits of processing that I worked through. Here's the original, or the final that I ended up with. So we'll get to that in a minute. Let me go turn off all my layers so that we're down to the 3 layers that I originally started with, that I auto aligned and had set up my different versions. And so this is going to be a little bit, because I did the work, but the idea was, let me turn off these 2 layers. So this was the more brightly exposed version. I put it on the bottom because I'd wanted to use just bits and pieces of it, namely the water. I wanted the water to come through from this exposure, but to use the dark of the rocks and such from the other darker exposure. So what I did is, here's the darker version, just sort of laid over it without a layer mask on it, so you can see it's taking up, it basically covers up the entire more brightly exposed version. But I only wanted I wanted to use most of this, but to allow parts of the layer that were underneath to come through. So what I did was created a mask and brushed out some of this darker exposure to let the lighter exposure come through. So that was what this mask is doing, to allow just part of the brighter expose on the water to come through. And so with the mask, turning the mask on and off, you can see here's with the mask when I'm letting some of the lighter come through, and here's the darker bit, the original exposure, or the darker exposure with none of the brighter exposure coming through. But when I turn the mask on, you can see I'm letting some of the water come through, the brighter water come through, to give it more of a glow. And this was pretty close to what I like I said, but I had the HDR version, so I wanted to see if there was anything I could use of it, because here's the HDR version sitting on top of everything. But like I say, I only wanted a little bit of it, so I created a mask and filled it with black, and only brought in pieces of the HDR version. So there's just a little bit, when I turn it on and off here, you can see just little pieces that I brought in. Excuse me. So there wasn't much that I used, but sort of had it there. I don't know that it necessarily adds a whole lot to the image, but it was there, and that's what I used. So then I took that, and was sort of happy with it, and merged all that together so that now that was one layer. I didn't flatten the image at this point. Some people do that and get rid of these layers. I tend to just merge and work from there, so that I can go, but I can turn this off and go back if I wanted to, and clean things up, or show my thought process as I went through the image. So then the next thing that I wanted is there a lot of these leaves were kind of distracting. There's a lot of little bright points of light in here, very I felt were kind of distracting, but I needed some leaves on there, obviously, to tell what season this was and when it was going on. So what I did was went in and created a new layer, clone tool, healing brush tool, cleaned up just some of the leaves and little bits of stuff that are on in the water and such. So I just went through, took some time and cleaned up some of those that were sort of brighter, and sticking out on their own, like, such as these that were hard to, they just sort of drag your eye over here someplace where I didn't really like, this spot up here, those kind of things. So just sort of cleaned those up a bit and then merged that because the only thing on this layer is, I'll show you is just the cleanup work that I did. So I was using the clone stamp tool to select from the layers below when I was working on this. So when I was in the clone stamp tool, the options were to sample the current and below layers, so I could go through and get pieces, but then I could just write them on here and turn those on and off, sort of like I've been demoing here, where I can just turn this on and off and see what it was before and after, see if it helped or not. So then I merged that into a layer, and then it was like, well, it's a little cool for me. So I went into Color Effects Pro and used one of the warming filters on it. And then if you'll notice the opacity, I ended up at 43%. Here's what it was originally coming out of Color Effects Pro and that preset that I used, but saying, well, that's too warm for me. So I brought it down, and like I say, ended up at 43%. Sort of looked right to my eye at the time. Came back, merged that in again, and ran it through again, another Nick Color Effects, or the Sharpener Pro, to sharpen the image and give it just a little bit of sort of focus to it. You can see it just a little bit in places like over here, where I just added a little bit of sharpening just to sort of give your eye something a little bit more to latch onto. But I didn't want to do that to the water, since I'd gone to all this effort of a 20-second exposure, or excuse me, 13-second exposure to get the smoothness in this water. I didn't completely want to sharpen that. So I put a mask on, and you're probably not going to be able to see this differences in the video quality, but I masked out that sharpening over the water. So I used just little bits and pieces of just to bring a little bit less sharpening into the water. So that was the mask, and then that was it. Then I saved it in here in Photoshop, and I'll not do that now since I've already got this, and then that brought me to the image in Lightroom, and then I went in for my finishing touches, things I tend to do to most of my shots when I'm done with it, and it's mainly a post-crop vignette to sort of bring the focus in to the middle. I think I played around in this one, even coming out of the processing in Photoshop, I played around with shadows and blacks, opened them up a little bit more, even from what was in there, so you could get some of the detail that's in this part of the image, so it wasn't a solid black. So I brought the shadows and the highlights, or the shadows and the blacks up, even from what I'd done. Could have done it in Photoshop. Seemed easy enough to do it here, and actually increase the exposure some in here as well to brighten things back up from where they originally were in the Photoshop image. Um, and so that's about it. Sort of a quick run through, how I got to this image, with starting from this image that came out of my camera. Um, and so hopefully that was useful and was beneficial, or might be, help someone learn a little bit, about using layer mask and sort of building a stack of images and such, or and using bits and pieces of things into an image. And just because you've got one image captured, you can do a couple of different treatments and use pieces here and there. Like I say, you could do a lot of different things here on these rocks if you wanted, or such as that. But this was the image. This was my thought process as I went through and built this. And like I say, some folks asked me about it, and so I figured I'd run through this real quick and share that, and hopefully someone will get some benefit out of it, or maybe learn something from it. And if not, hopefully it wasn't too much of your time wasted if you didn't learn anything. But anyway, that's it, and I'm out for now. Talk to you later.